very much for that introduction. It's great to be in Belfast, actually. I did spend 4 years of my life here back in the 50s. And then, as I was telling somebody, my father died in Belfast, and then my mother made the wise decision to go back to Portrush. So I claim to be really from Portrush and not from Belfast. But I've been out in Australia since 1972. That's a long time ago, and one of the things I got involved in 3 or 4 years ago was a major exhibition on the Irish in Australia. Now, this wasn't a small thing. This was 1,000 square metres of exhibition space and 480 objects from all over the world. And we brought a lot of material from Ireland, and there is no way, you can see the title, Ned Kelly and all that, the story of the Irish in Australia, 1788 to the present in 30 minutes. But it's not going to happen quite like that. I really had to cut it all down for you and think about what I would concentrate on. But this was certainly the first ever effort to get to grips with the story of the Irish in one major diaspora country. It's never been done in the United States, and you can imagine the issues and the problems of simply trying physically to do it. It hasn't been done in Canada, certainly not in Great Britain that I have ever heard, or in New Zealand. So we pride ourselves on the fact that we were the first place to actually think, well, how would you put an exhibition together on the Irish in the whole country? From the very beginning, and we brought stuff, as I said, from all over the place, and I'll show you a couple of those things. The title of the exhibition is kind of interesting, not just Ned. That's the catalogue there you can see to the left. True history of the Irish in Australia. As a historian, that wasn't my title, that was a public relations exercise from the public relations department, who thought that it had to be advertised as something that pulled people in. And the Not Just Ned title is important. Were there any of you here in the audience who had never heard of Ned Kelly? You see, no one puts their hand up. And that was sort of the point, is that if you asked Australians in the street in Sydney or in Melbourne or Perth or wherever it was, name one person, one Irish person that you know about who has something to do with the history of Australia, and I guarantee you, Ned Kelly will be the name. Everybody knows that name. Even modern immigrants have sort of can stumble through to Ned Kelly. Of course, Ned Kelly wasn't Irish. He was born in Australia. He was born in Victoria, of Irish parents. One from Tipperary, Reid Kelly, and Ellen Quinn from Antrim. No one's ever tracked Ellen Quinn down. We know exactly where John Reid Kelly was from, in Killinall in Tipperary, but no one's ever discovered where Ellen is from in County Antrim. He was a convict and she was an assistant immigrant, which was interesting. Anyway, so we played around for a long time with what would be the title of the exhibition. I didn't come up with it, I couldn't think of it. It was the Irish in Australia. And then one night, a couple of people in the public relations area or the publications area were talking. And someone said, this exhibition is not just about Ned Kelly, not just Ned. In other words, that the exhibition actually goes way beyond the idea that the Irish in Australia is simply associated with this bandit, Ned Kelly. And it worked. People got the message on all that. So let's move through and look at a few things relating to it. What I thought I would do is go through some of the emigration stuff that actually came up, because one of our big areas dealt with migration. You can imagine going through 480 objects, there's no way I could actually get to the whole thing. So I thought I'll concentrate on the emigration for you, and then I'll mention a few of the other objects at the end. I don't know if you know much about emigration to Australia. If you picked up the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland's little leaflet on emigration to Australia, you would be in despair. I'd have to say, ladies and gentlemen, with the greatest respect to the people from here. We have offered to maybe do a little bit of a redesign of that. It's a complicated...
You're very welcome. You're greatly welcome.
That's all right. No, I don't know. We'll think about it. But
we might due for a refresh.
But it's a complicated story. Again, I suspect in Ireland, if you ask people who went to Australia in the 19th century, and certainly down in the Republic, the response always will be about chains and convicts and things of that nature. So very much in people's heads in Ireland that it's the convict story. The convict story is there, by the way, and it's important, and it's a fascinating story, but it's only very much part of the story. Probably only about 1 in 10 of all the immigrants who went as free immigrants to Australia in the 19th century from Ireland, I'm talking about the whole of Ireland now, not just about the north or the south or the east or the west, 1 in 10 was a convict, and the rest were free immigrants. And most of those, in fact probably 80% of those, would have been government-assisted immigrants, relying on assistance from one of the Australian colonies, from New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia, Queensland, particularly in the 1870s and 1880s. That's how they got to Australia. So the Irish communities that established themselves in Australia, whether they were Protestant communities or Catholic communities, were largely free immigrants, not convicts. And the studies that have been done on the convicts suggest also, very obviously, and this is not a surprise, is I think there's something like 3 men to every 1 woman, or is it bigger than that period? It might even be more.
Depends what period.
Depends what period, but certainly convict men outnumbered the women by a huge number. So the number of convict men who actually settled and had families, and then their descendants are dispersed through the community, would be small by comparison with the assisted emigrant communities. They're the communities that found the Irish Australian communities in the 19th century. Now we had some lovely things in the exhibition to suggest emigration. This was one of them. I'm sure some of you have probably seen this, a painting in the National Gallery in Dublin, an emigrant ship, Dublin Bay Sunset by Edwin Hayes. It's extremely iconic and very famous. It's been out in Australia at least 4 or 5 times for other exhibitions, but not relating particularly to the Irish. But I just like it because it has this kind of sunset glow to it, and we're leaving the old land and we're heading to the new and so on. Let's hope I hit the right button here to get on to the next. It's a clicker thing, isn't it?
Yes.
And you just click the. Yes, like that. Very good. So you see, here's the arrival, and we had these 2 in the exhibition to sort of suggest the 2 different ends of the globe of people leaving Ireland and then people arriving in Sydney Harbour. That has a much more uplifting, positive, daylight kind of effect to arriving in the new land and all this sort of stuff. But the really interesting thing from the point of view of looking at the migration is this business about the assisted emigration that I told you about. I would make this comment, and Perry can correct me if I'm wrong, and she knows I'm not wrong in this. The records in Sydney, now this doesn't cover Melbourne, it doesn't cover Brisbane nearly as well, or South or Adelaide. The records in Sydney relating to the assisted emigrants are probably the best emigration records about the Irish anywhere in the world. Those of you who had to deal with people going to New York or Boston or Canada or these sort of things from Ireland will know that the shipping records in those places are very skimpy indeed. In Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide, they're there, but again, they're nothing like the Sydney ones. When you got to Sydney, you sat in front, or you stood in front, of the gentleman of the Immigration Board from about 1848 onwards. Before that, there would be other ways of recording where you were from. And you were asked all sorts of details about yourself. And they were all taken down. There was a clerk writing busily away there somewhere, taking down all the details of that emigrant on that particular ship. And I'll show you in a minute just how detailed that is. Other questions would be asked, such, did you have a good voyage? Was there enough water? Was the food adequate? Was there anything you want to complain about, etc.? Now this is very different to the view of migration to the United States, particularly during the famine, of course, when you have these dreadful voyages across to Canada, to Grosse Ile, etc. The Australian voyage is always, even in convict times, a well-run voyage. It's 3 months or 4 months. They want people to arrive in good health and ready to work. And the same applied to the convicts. After some of the very early disastrous voyages, they appointed surgeons, Royal Naval surgeons, and they ran those voyages efficiently. And the death rate at sea on these voyages is very, very low. In fact, it has been said it's the first time of these major transnational voyages, in terms of people coming from Great Britain and Ireland, that the death rate at sea was equal to the death rate on land, whereas across the North Atlantic it's higher in the 1850s. So the Australian thing is extremely well run. And this is what you get in terms of a record. This is a pointer here. Works. Okay. Other way around, like that? Yes. All right, here's the ship Vocalist arriving the 11th of October 1856. This is the immigration as inspected by the Immigration Board, and I show you an image of the board there. What do you get? You get across the top line just John McKinley, age 27. He's a farm labourer from Berleak, Fermanagh. His parents are William and Mary, father dead, mother living still in Berleak. He's Church of England, he reads, he has no relations to the colony, good physical health, and he has been brought out under what they call the Assisted Immigrant Act. I think, is that that period? I can't see. Yes. Yeah. So down the side here is the way in which he was brought out to Sydney. That is an enormous amount of information on the ship, and that goes through all the way from 1848 to 1870. It changes a bit in the 1870s and 80s, but you can still get these places of origin. For my sins, for my doctorate in Canberra years ago, I computerized 44,000 of these people using these shipping lists from 1848 to 1870. People always ask me, why did you concentrate on 1848 to 1870? Well, I went in and I had a look at the material from the mid-1830s to the late 1840s and the later stuff, and I discovered the writing was good. So it was as almost, but not quite as simple as that. I later discovered I was fortunate because 1847 was a watershed in terms of the way that the passage was actually run, the assisted passage. It changed from being run by ship owners in Great Britain to run by the Land and Emigration Commissioners in London. So there was actually quite a significant change in policy and direction at that particular moment. So anyways, you can see these are absolutely wonderful lists to deal with. I mean, there's just a whole family, Malone family from New Ross in Wexford. Phillip Malone, he's age 40, his parents are both dead. But he's brought out, you see £32.10 remittance regulations was put down by his uncle, Nicholas Chapman, living in the Williams River, which is north of Sydney. And again, that was a system whereby people in the colony could actually sponsor people to come out. And all those sponsorship records are actually there. They come out as ordinary assisted immigrants, right, under these ships of the Land and Emigration Commission. And all that kind of detail allows you, by the way, to play with chain migration all the way through the 1840s, 50s, and it's astonishing. You know, if you go back and start looking at it, there's a little place I lived in Australia for 12 years before I went to Canberra, called Kiama on the south coast. It's about 60 miles south of Sydney. And when I tell you that there were, in the 1920s there was a Fermanagh cinema in Kiama, you get a sense of the location of where the emigrants came from in Ireland. Dozens and dozens of them came from the parishes around Enniskillen going north of Lough Erne, and from the same parishes adjacent in South Tyrone. That area sent hundreds of emigrants to New South Wales, very largely Church of Ireland emigrants, which is quite interesting. Kiama at one stage had 12 orange lodges in the area, so that was very dense. Out in Burrowa in New South Wales, another little place, was full of Tipperary and Clare people, these are Catholic Irish thing. So you can see these are amazing records in terms of establishing story and everything else. So the story, when you're looking at the settlement of the Irish and who the Irish are, there's a vast amount of stuff. There are other bits and pieces which unfortunately haven't survived very well. Most of the immigration stuff that here, for example in London, there would have been the application forms of every single immigrant or emigrant under the Land and Emigration Commissioners. They had thousands and thousands of these things, and they all disappeared in 1872 when the commissioners stopped doing the assisted passage to New South Wales and was taken over by the New South Wales government. But odd little things survive. The form you fill in to see if you fill in the form. In other words, they didn't want people in Ireland or Scotland, you know, having to send for a form. There were huge, great forms, and they had to get references from the local minister, from the doctor, all this kind of thing. They didn't want them going to all that trouble unless they were suitable immigrants or emigrants. So you filled in a form and sent it off to the Land and Emigration Commissioners in London to see whether you should fill in the whole form, and they would send the form back to you. So I thought that's rather bureaucratic and rather nice to find that level. And this was one that was in the Monteagle papers actually in Dublin. I won't go into the detail of it, but it's what you did, and they sent it back to you saying yes, you should fill in the form. And then you get into, you know, the way the whole thing runs, piles and piles and piles of material about these ships. It's the kind of emigration during the famine, for example. Let's take the famine as an example. If you're destitute and hungry and you want to leave Ireland, you don't apply for an assisted passage in New South Wales, because it takes you at least 6 months, probably, from the initial application for the form to go over to London, from the Immigration Commissioner's clerks to approve of you, and then they send you a passage ticket and tell you to be in Plymouth or Liverpool on a certain date, and to bring a certain set of clothes with you in a box, etc., etc. The whole thing was time and a bit of money, and so you weren't sitting there absolutely, you know, waiting to. You couldn't. It was a gradual process and a bureaucratic process, all very controlled by the commissioners. With, you know, the outfit you had to have. Candidates would find their own outfit, which would be inspected before emigration. So in other words, you would get over to Liverpool and they would open your box and say, well, you haven't got enough clothes there for a 3-month voyage going to Sydney. You go through all these different climatic conditions in the Atlantic and then down into the roaring 40s, into the almost Antarctic regions. And so you will have to go out into Liverpool and buy more. And I've got evidence of people being sent back because they did not have enough clothing with them. So it's pretty regulated. It just goes on and on. There's stacks of this sort of thing to tell you exactly how it's run and what you have to contribute and everything else. And then this is the form. So you see, I mean, the form is very detailed indeed. Have you ever been married? Name, address, and occupation, of your present or last employer and the time you served in that situation. So it's asking you for an awful lot of information. And all those forms did exist, as I say, in London and vanished, sadly, when the commissioners went out in 1872. Amazing, amazing record, amazing record. All right, the exhibition. What did we do about emigration in the exhibition? Because obviously there is a huge story. And as somebody who did a PhD on it and wrote a book about it, you can't put a book on walls in an exhibition. People don't come to see bits of paper. They come to see things, objects that will convey something of the story. So we looked at some of the objects that might do this. One of them came from this place. This is the chapel of the Loreto Order in Ballarat, in Mary's Man. Wonderful place, huge, big girls' school in Ballarat and in Victoria. Ballarat was one of the centres of the gold rush in the 1850s. Lots of Irish came and settled there, and quite a few Catholic Irish did extremely well in Ballarat, made lots and lots of money. So the Loretos came out from Ireland, I think it was the 1870s, about the 70s. Mary Gonzaga Berry, they founded this magnificent building and girls' school and built this huge chapel. They had when I went to see, that's a very bad slide, I apologise for that, but they had an amazing amount of stuff relating to the nuns. Huge amount of objects. They had a museum corridor, and then they had a whole museum. Absolutely wonderful place. In this museum corridor here, there's a whole lot of bits and pieces in these cases, and one of them was that, a piece of Irish turf. And I sort of like to imagine the nuns, sort of getting this out at night over a cup of tea and sitting and thinking of the old country and all that kind of thing. But there were two pieces of Irish turf sitting in there labelled Irish turf. Another thing they had in there, which was even more extraordinary, was a piece of the Treaty Stone from Limerick. If you know the Treaty Stone of 1690, it's on the bridge, St John's Bridge, just on the other side. And it's very famous, of course, because from that came the wild geese and the fleeing of the Irish army to Europe. And anyway, this was a bit of Treaty Stone that brought back, when they named the gentleman as a Reverend so-and-so. I wonder, did he sort of stoop down in the middle of the night and chip away at this thing, bring out this bit of the Treaty Stone? Could you find the stone today? Well, the stone is there. Could you go along with that bit and see if it actually fitted? I didn't bring it into the exhibition because it was a bit obscure to explain to Australians how significant something like the Treaty Stone was. But the turf certainly, resonated with people. They could see the idea of the turf. And then we had other more conventional things like this, female emigration to New South Wales. This is a poster put up in Cork in the 1830s, the very early days of the assisted passage, to entice young women to go out as single female emigrants, because the colony was always short of women. There was an imbalance in the sexes. They also wanted domestic servants, so there was a big push from about 1832-33 onwards to get single women to go. That then morphed into a much bigger scheme of assisted passage from these very early passages. But this was one that was there in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, so we borrowed that. Things like this are a bit more unusual in many ways. There's a place in Sydney called the Hyde Park Barracks. The barracks was set up as a depot to take in assisted immigrant women. When you arrived in Sydney from 1848 onwards, all the single women were sent straight up to the barracks. And the single men and the families stayed on the ship, and they were hired from the ship. But they were always concerned about, people, about the single women, about the morality on the voyage, about the sailors were getting at the women. This went on and on and on in the record. Very interesting indeed. They're always building little grills to make sure the crew could not come near the decks where the single women were, and so on. But anyway, in Hyde Park Barracks, they would all be brought up there with their boxes of clothing, and then they would be hired from there. There'd be a hiring day where employers would come in, and there's quite a lot of material about that, written material, printed material about the hiring. But under the floorboards of the barracks, when they converted the barracks years ago from being, it was a court, wasn't it? It was a courthouse. Converted it and started looking at it, and they ripped up the floorboards. Here was all this material that had obviously been stuffed down, from the 1850s and 1860s. And among that material were things like bonnets, women's bonnets from the actual period. Now, we don't know whose that was or anything about, except that it comes from the 1850s and undoubtedly belonged to an assisted immigrant girl at that particular period. So we put that on show along with a couple of other things I will show you about the women's emigration. That's the barracks in Sydney today. This big wall there, and you go in there, and up on that floor now they have an exhibition about assisted passage, women assisted passage, Barry, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, like female assisted passage. But it's an old convict building. It was converted. It was originally built, I think, 1819, and it was converted in 1848 into a female immigrant depot, and it had a life as a depot up until the 1880s. Other interesting things that we found that came out. This is I think a lovely little thing. It was a little prayer book, old prayer book that belonged to this lady here. She was Grace Mullen. Here she is here, at older age in 1858. But she came out on the James Paterson in 1837 with this prayer book. And then inside the prayer book she wrote this nice little sort of inscription, Grace McCrone, that was her, otherwise Mullen. She married a McCrone who was an ex-convict. Is my name, and Ireland is my nation, New South Wales my dwelling place, and heaven my destination. When I am dead and in my grave, and all my bones is rotten, this little book will tell my name when I am forgotten. Grace McCrone, otherwise Mullen. It's a beautiful object, and it exists in the family in Oregon, in America. It was lent to us by the family because Pearl Grace and her husband went off to the northwestern part of the United States, where she died on a canoe in Indian Territory, paddling in 1862 with a couple of her kids. But the descendants are still there, and they had the prayer book. So I thought, well, that little prayer book has gone round the world in terms of its story. Another really remarkable object was this one, the Rajah quilt. One of the problems, of course, that we dealt with was we did have a lot of convicts coming out from Ireland. It's about 36,000 of them to New South Wales between 1788 and 1840, and then a whole lot more, about another 10,000 or so to Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land in the 1840s, early 1850s. How do you represent that voyage? That was tricky. There's actually very, very little left, which we could say personal objects belonging to a convict. In fact, nothing. Right? Nobody's ever found anything that you can say that belonged to this particular person. Stuff later on in their lives, but not when they were convicts. So this Rajah quilt became extremely interesting. This was a ship that came out in the 1840s to Van Diemen's Land from England, not from Ireland, but on board, fortunately for us, and I'll just go to that in a minute, this was it being put up. We borrowed that from the National Gallery in Canberra, and they had to come in, and they had these ladies from there, the curators had to spend the whole morning doing these strange things to it to make it right in the way you actually display it. It's a very delicate piece. It's got a name. That's it. In the middle of it is this lovely little inscription: to the ladies of the Convict Ship Committee, this quilt worked by the convicts of the ship Rajah during their voyage to Van Diemen's Land is presented as a testimony of the gratitude with which they remember the exertions for their welfare while in England and during their passage, and also as a proof that they have not neglected the ladies' kind admonitions of being industrious. June 1841. It's a lovely little inscription woven into it. But on that ship, fortunately for us, were a whole lot of Irish women as well. So we could turn it into an object about Irish female convicts going to Tasmania, and it worked very well. And we had one lady there, I'm going to show you her record, here it is, Louisa Dale. Louisa Dale, when she gave her name out there into the description list of the convicts, there's a lot of records about convicts in Tasmania. Just go into Google, put Tasmanian convicts, and you'd be astonished at the stuff that comes up. Anyway, she just said she was from the north of Ireland. So she could be anywhere, right? But she is definitely Irish, and she was a tailoress. So we assume from that she must have been one of the ones who would definitely have worked on the Rajah quilt in the voyage. So it was a wonderful object with which to associate a female convict voyage to Australia at that particular time. The key object, the one that sort of carried, if you like, the big message, was this one, which is found, well, was originally found on a beach. This is Moana Beach in South Australia, just south of Adelaide, about 60 kilometres south of Adelaide City. And in the 1880s, washed up on that beach was this, the anchor of the Nashwauk. And the Nashwauk was an assisted emigrant ship that came out in the mid-1855 to Adelaide, and 95% of the people on board were Irish, and a lot of young single Irish women among them. And when they were shipwrecked at Moana on that beach, so the ship was wrecked off the beach, obviously, they were all brought on shore and looked after by the locals. They were obviously in a very destitute state at that point. And then they were brought up to Adelaide, where they were hired and everything else. It was interesting, the newspaper account of it said that a ship had come down from Adelaide to take them up to Adelaide, and half the young Irish women wouldn't get on it again. They said they were never getting on a ship ever again in their lives, so they had to go up by dray instead. But in relation to them, in the state archives, or records, sorry, the state records of South Australia was a nice list of all these women and the fact that they had given them new clothing. So that was nice to actually associate with the anchor. So down here, here's all their names. They were given boots, stockings, bonnets, petticoats, etc., by the destitute poor. So they were re-kitted out because they would have had a full kit in their immigrant box. It's got an interesting story, this thing. When I went over there to have a look at it, this was the manager, wife of the manager of the park. She thought this was a great gag that I'd come all the way from Canberra, which is quite a way from Adelaide, to look at this anchor. And we brought it back for the exhibition, and it was embedded in this bit of concrete. It was interesting because when we came to lift it out of there, we thought there must have been two big flanges would kind of go down and hold it securely in. Not a bit of it. As soon as you took the concrete away, it was all rusting underneath. And the manager told us, thank God you did that, because people camp all around this, over the Christmas period when they come down, and that whole place is packed. And so at some stage that anchor would have come crashing down, hopefully not on anybody, but you know what I mean. So they thanked us very much for coming over and looking at this. But there were reports in the local paper. Some people wrote in and said, Dr. Reid, don't take our anchor away from us. We're going to grab it away in camera all the way over there. It'll never come back. And take a photograph and put it in the exhibition. But we did a lot from Moana. We took the anchor and we did a whole lot of restoration work on it, right, on the bottom. And the Moana Council were delighted with this because they have now completely redesigned a whole display around this anchor. I'll show you in a minute. So there they are, conserving the anchor, and that's what it went up like that, as, if you like, one of the key kind of images of the idea of migration to Australia, along with down there the document I showed you, giving the young women the extra stuff. Beside it was this little model of a ship called the Inchinen. Now the Inchinen, and Perry will be talking about this, had a lot of orphan girls on it. We were talking about the orphan immigrants. And that ship came out in 1849, and when it had deposited its orphan girls in Adelaide, it went on to Wellington in New Zealand, where it sank. So it only ever had two voyages, one voyage across the North Atlantic when it was built, and the next voyage out from Plymouth to Adelaide bringing young women, and then I suppose there's a third one across to New Zealand. It was on the way to South America, where it actually sank. We had this lovely little model of it. What I hoped to get was not just, that was the Nashwauk, it also had the Nashwauk Crescent, and they put a whole new display there, right beside where it was in the park. It was in there, now it's got this whole nice canopy and display outside. I hadn't come to the Inchin, I'll finish off with that. The other thing that we had on display about the emigration was one box. Every emigrant had to have a box like this, with clothing inside. And this box actually related to an orphan girl, Margaret Hurley, who came from the Gort Workhouse in 1849. And this box was built in the Gort Workhouse for these young women who had come out of it. In the Gort Union minutes, it actually says the carpenter's name that made this box. And it's the only one I found that we know of from this period. But it's typical of all the immigrant boxes. And what's really nice about it is inside was all the clothing that they had given to Margaret Hurley, who was a destitute orphan girl during the famine. She would be in the workhouse register if it existed for Gort, but she offered herself as an immigrant to Australia, so this is still in the family in New South Wales. Very, very unusual indeed. You can see the things there, a hairbrush, prayer book, scissors, etc., that would have been issued to her. And I wrote a book, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Cheryl Munger, we wrote a book about that particular ship, where we had the diary of the surgeon on the ship, Charles Strutt. But I want to finish off with this story of the Inconstant, this ship that I mentioned, not the Inchin, sorry, that's the wrong name, it was the Inconstant from Adelaide. It got to Adelaide in 1849. This is Mary Tate, photograph of her in old age. We found her entry in the workhouse register down in Dublin. North Dublin Union? Yeah, North Dublin Union. So she was on that ship. Just a page that gives a bit more detail about her. You've probably seen these things, these workhouse registers, so I won't go into much detail on that. There she is, Mary Tate. She's 16 years of age and she is sent to Australia. It says it should be sent to Australia in 1849. Now, what happened to the Inconstant? It sank in the harbour in New Zealand, in Wellington. It was then towed in and became a wharf called Plymouth Ark, which was one of the main wharves in Wellington. And then it disappeared from people's view. And when this bank in the middle of Wellington, which is now a long way from the sea, the floors were being torn up to look into what was, to reconstruct it, etc. It's still shopping arcade. It was an old bank. They found the Inconstant underneath the floor of the bank. There were all the old timbers of the ship. So they brought it into the exhibition they have in the Museum of Wellington and the sea, and there were all sorts of chemicals and water pours over these old beams to sort of keep them. Well, I wasn't able to do anything. I couldn't bring that to Canberra. That was really a bit too difficult. But what I did find was I asked somebody, I said, well, is there anything else left of the Inconstant? And someone in Wellington said, oh yes, the ship's bell exists. And it exists out at this church, St Albans, in Parahatanui in Wellington, which is about sort of 50 kilometres to the northwest of Wellington. So I rang up the church. I got up to this very nice lady there who was the minister. And I said, oh yes, she said, we've got the bell. I thought, wow, that'd be fantastic. We got the anchor, and we got a bell of this, the ship's bell of this church. I expected to be going up to Parahatanui, going in the door of the church, and that would be the bell, that would be a sort of object that they would have. So I said, oh yes, we've got the bell. So I hire a car and I go up there with great delight, thinking I'm really onto a significant object. The reason I loved the idea of the bell was that, of course, the girls would have listened to it every night on the ship. It would have been tolling as they, all the time. So this would have been something they never have forgotten, along the whole voyage. Sadly, the bell was in the bell tower and was painted, and so I looked at that and I said, oh, I expected it to be something transportable, and I think the minister had thought it would be great to be going over to Canberra, to bring the bell over and everything else, but sadly we couldn't do that. And we did have a few discussions with the Heritage Trust in New Zealand about the bell. She wanted to take it out, and I said it would have to be completely refurbished, get all that paint off it to make it look like an old ship's bell. Sadly, it just all got too hard, and so we had to simply put up with a model which had been built by the museum of the Inconstant instead. And that sort of all turned into the exhibition. Those are just some of the objects to try and tell the story of Irish migration to Australia in the 19th century. It was a much bigger exhibition than that, but we need to let Perry have some time to talk to you as well. And I hope that gives you some idea of the depth of story that there is, simply associated with a few simple objects from Australia about migration all those years ago. Thank you very much.
This has obviously set the theme of immigration, and I'm going to speak about just one aspect of that, and also about remembering and memorialisation. In Australia at the moment, we're having huge memories of World War I and Gallipoli and all that. And here, soon we'll have 1916. And I think it's very interesting what we choose to remember about anything. And indeed, many of you may well be here doing family history. Which family hooks you that you want to chase that family, and others that get neglected. So this particular talk is about the famine orphan girls who inspired the Irish community, the Irish-born community in Australia, to remember this particular set of girls. And Richard mentioned briefly the Thomas Arbuthnot. The surgeon superintendent on that ship, Edward Strutt, called his girls a decent set of girls, and that's why he, Richard and Shell wrote this book reconstructing sections of Strutt's diary about what he thought of the girls on the voyage. So I'm currently the chair of the Great Irish Famine Commemoration Committee, a great mouthful, that was started when this memorial was erected and unveiled in August 1998. The Irish community started raising money to build it in about 95, and ultimately here it is. Briefly, it is in the wall of the Hyde Park Barracks. This wall that Richard showed you, the corner was up here that he showed you before. This wall, a piece of the wall was removed and rotated on its axis. On the inside, as we have here, where we're sitting here, is the Hyde Park Barracks building itself. On the outside of the wall, which is a busy city street, College Street, and this way Macquarie Street, right in the heart of Sydney. On the outside of the wall is Ireland, famine. There's a bowl on a table that's got no bottom in the bowl, indicating famine. On the inside of this wall, and I'll show you an image of that in a minute, is a Lloyd, the potato spade, if you like, and a few small potatoes. And on this side of the wall is a table with a spoon and a plate, and representing the new world and survival and food. The intervening panels, and you can't quite see it there terribly well, but I will show you some better of it, has glass panels, and on the glass panels are etched the names of 410 of the 4,114 girls, to represent the names of all those orphan girls that came, and by extension the names of all Irish immigrants, not just women. So to cut to the chase for these orphan girls, and orphan in the sense of 19th century, in that one parent was dead, possibly two parents, and in some cases both parents are still alive. But the orphan girl scheme, in other words, removing respectable but destitute women from the workhouses to the colony that needed them as marriage partners and domestic servants. So these are the numbers. 11 ships went to Sydney with 2,253. 6 ships to Port Phillip, which was at that stage part of New South Wales, until 1851, and then 3 ships to Adelaide. And in that order, the records are from terrific to increasingly poor. The immigration list that Richard put up exists for the orphan girls for the 11 ships to Sydney. The ships to Port Phillip are less better, if you like, not the full detail of parents' names, etc. And the 3 ships to Adelaide, there is one listing for the Elgin, which tells you the girl's name and their age, and the other 2 ships are basically their names in the Adelaide Advertiser, the newspaper. So this operation this assisted immigration scheme operated from the first ship left on the 3rd of June 1848, and the last ship left on the 8th of April 1850. All of them sailed, all 20 ships sailed from Plymouth. Every county sent girls, but not every workhouse. The first phase of the workhouses, which started to be built after the Act in Ireland of 1838, were up just in time for the famine. They weren't built as a result of the famine, but they were built to assist the destitute poor of Ireland, if you like. But they had no idea that they would be just up in time to rescue a few people from the desperation of the famine. So there were 130 workhouses built initially, and these orphan girls came from 119 of those workhouses. The numbers that were sent, these are in order of the biggest numbers came from Tipperary, 477 from 8 workhouses, down to the 4th largest number of 220 from four workhouses in Limerick. From Ulster, and we didn't actually ask our audience whether you're Ulsters, Australians or elsewhere, Americans. So forgive us for kind of pointing this a little bit towards Ulster, given we're standing here. The 9 counties of Ulster, including of course the 6 of Northern Ireland, these sent 1,104 girls from these workhouses in those numbers. Now, I've got a database of all the girls that I add to almost on a daily basis. Richard and I have been searching the Polo Union minute books and the surviving indoor registers, which, like the one there for Mary Tafe that he put up, show you the names of the girls, but unfortunately they don't survive for anything like all the workhouses. But the minute books give you a bit of an idea of what's going on in the workhouse at the time. There are a very few listings in the Polo Union minute books of the girls that went. This is one for Clonmel that shows you the names of 28 girls from that Union workhouse, listed here by their names and ages, who were to emigrate from that particular union, the Clonmel Union, on the 18th of April 1849. That's gold, but there's very little of it, unfortunately. Then that same minute book goes on to explain that a few girls couldn't go because they were in fever, but they then went later, and there's lists here of the 8 that did go. That's another example of the indoor minutes, showing you here Teresa Keogh, who's 14, she's deserted, she's Catholic and sickly at that stage. She's from the Union at large, so that particular area, and unusually, and again it's gold, this particular register has Australia on it. I wish they all did. It would make it very easy to find where they went. And of course these are arranged by order of when they came into the workhouse, not when they went out. So actually finding them is a huge task. Of the 4,114 girls, I've got photographs of about 106. This is just one story of Catherine Fox, who came on the Earl Grey, the first ship to Sydney, as a 17-year-old nursemaid from Killyman, which is a parish in Armagh. Both her parents, Patrick and Fanny, were dead. She was Catholic, she could read and write, and she married Icefall Graham. Now, what was in the Polo Union books for the Armagh register was that she went into the workhouse on the 10th of May 1847, was aged 17. She was tolerably well clothed from Armagh town, and she went out on the 7th of July. But she came back in again on the 10th, and this is not unusual from what I've found about the few that do survive. She was then thinly clothed and hungry, and then she went out again on the 24th of May and sailed on the Earl Grey on the 3rd of June, that time frame being enough to get her out of the workhouse in Armagh and across the Irish Sea to Plymouth to get on that boat to sail then. Again, an assisted immigrant ship. This is the Earl Grey. You can see these orphan girls are part of the colonial land immigration schemes. They're not special in that way, they're special in the way they're selected, but they are part of this scheme. And here is Catherine Fox as a nursemaid, where she's from in Killyman and Armagh. The parents' names, Catholic, both read and write. And many may think that's unusual, but it's remarkable the amount that could read and write, and it brings in the whole discussion on literacy in the middle of the 19th century in Ireland as well. Some of these also, you'll notice, do have some relation in the colony. 3 on that page have a relation in the colony. Catherine Fox does not. So in a way, it's chain migration again, a way of getting to Australia, but they were chosen for different reasons. A couple of, excuse the image, but some of these pictures that come from descendants, we're very lucky to have any image, even a poor one like that. She survived until 1883, and you may have noticed the girl before lived until 1920. Some of these were real survivors. I love this picture. If you'd had 10 children, I'm not sure I'd be still standing there holding hands, but you know, that's a girl thing of the 21st century. But I think that's the most brilliant picture, and she again is an Earl Grey girl that survives until 1903. Sarah Arbuckle, who came on the Derwent, with her two sisters. So they're not totally alone, even if they have both parents dead. There are little groups that go certainly from the same workhouse. They had been in the same workhouse. They had probably established relationships and friendships. And there are groups of sisters, in this case 3 sisters that go on the Derwent to Port Phillip. This lady is multiply married, has 3 marriages. And one thing that comes through in the photographs that survive of the girls is their family. This family photograph of her, obviously in older age, with a little girl on her knee, 2 other children, and her daughter and sons or sons-in-law. When she died, this is one of the real legacies, and I'll read this one to you, the obituary of Elizabeth Sharkey, who dies under the name of her 3rd husband. The friends of the family of the late Mrs. William Garment Sr. are respectively invited to attend her funeral to move from the residence of her daughter, Mrs. T. Musgrove, of 58 Rocket Street, at 10 a.m. this Wednesday morning for the Church of England Cemetery in Bathurst. Now Bathurst's over the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, about a 3-hour drive, and so that's where the family established themselves. The death occurred yesterday morning of an old and respected resident in the person of Mrs. William Garment in her 86th year, who had resided in the district for over 60 years. The deceased lady was a native of the north of Ireland and came to the state at an early age. She leaves a family of 2 sons and 4 daughters, and it names them all as Mrs. this and Mr. that. Again, the importance of family. Mary Sloane, who married James Orr, a name that's quite prominent here in Antrim. There are lots of Orr families that immigrated or went as convicts to New South Wales, and here she is with her family. I put this story up because the family story of Margaret McAvoy, who dies in 1929, aged 96, reputedly, while in the garden digging potatoes, she had a fall and broke her hip. I have not been able to find any proof of that. There's certainly no record of that in the newspaper, but the fact that story survives in the family, I think is very interesting. And the family history is the legacy of these girls. But they were not the first single women that were to come in groups to the colonies of Australia. In the 1830s, and again Richard mentioned this before, there was a scheme to bring single girls to Australia at a period when transportation was still operating at its height. The 1830s was a high period of convict transportation to New South Wales in particular, for the Irish, but also to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania as it's now called. And a number of girls came. This is a contemporary sketch that was done in England for English girls coming at that stage, and it represents the girls as leaving, on this side, leaving England and leaving workhouses. This block here is supposedly a workhouse, and I'd rather be a butterfly, says one, where they can fly to the other side. And on this side there's a man with a net, and he says, "I spies mine. Are you ready, Mr. Clergyman?" And myself and a friend, Dr. Liz Russian, have been working on it. She did her PhD on these 1830s girls, and together we've been working on a series of books. The 2 pilot ships that were sent in the 1830s was the Red Rover, which brought Irish girls to Sydney, and the Princess Royal, which brought English girls to Van Diemen's Land. And they were seen, as in this image, as a flight of fair game. So just to let you know that those exist. Mary Ann Young arrived as an orphan girl on the Thomas Arbuthnot, it's not the Sir Thomas Arbuthnot, in 1850. And she is one of many who didn't have a totally happy life. She had 2 marriages. Her first husband died, and her second husband beat her up. in a fit of pique and frustration in 1872, remembering that she arrives in 1850, in 1872 she stabbed him and killed him and was jailed for manslaughter. This is the only image we have of her from a jail photographic book. But she only was in jail for 3 months, so there was some, the courts were fairly lenient upon her, and she survived. Not for a long and happy life, but for a longer life. Now, I started off talking about memorialisation, and of course, the memories and memorials to the famine in Ireland are numerous. This was one of the first, built on the site of the Ennistymen Workhouse in County Clare. Emotive image of a little boy knocking on the door of the workhouse with a quote from the Poor Law Union minutes saying that his mother had died, and if he was not allowed enter and find refuge, he too would soon join her in starvation. Very emotive. And of course, I don't know how many of you have ever been to the foot of Croagh at Barracks in County Mayo, not far from Westport, but this is where the Irish National Memorial to the famine is, and it's depicting an immigrant ship in the way of a coffin ship, which is how the immigration to America is often seen, where the images within the sails are skeletal. Again, very emotive. No names, nothing, it just sits there in this most holy of places of Ireland, and it's a fantastic memorial if you ever can get a chance to go and see that. One of the surviving memorials, I think, is the workhouses that do survive. Of the 130 workhouses in that first phase, I haven't actually counted how many survive, but they survive in various forms. Some are gone completely. Many in the early 1920s were redesigned into part of local hospitals, partially destroyed. The one here in Belfast, I love the fact that it's now the women's dementia unit in the hospital in Belfast. So it's still looking after women in crisis. Carrick Macross, where Richard and I will be going tomorrow afternoon, has been revamped as a community centre. There's babysitting facilities in there, training for computerisation, and all sorts of local community have been reused in there. Places like Ballyshannon are falling down. Mullingar is part of the local hospital as well, and Burr stands, Parsonstown as it was, Burr's huge workhouse still stands, but it's in a pretty destitute state. And it was purchased by a private man in the middle of the huge Celtic Tiger boom, who was then unable to do what he wanted to do. He was going to build a large housing estate there. So it's sitting unable for anything to happen to it because it's owned privately. So the state can't do anything with it either. And many are in this state, and as I said, many have gone. From my point of view as the chair of this Great Irish Famine Commemoration Committee, there is no way I can do, or our small committee can do, the genealogy of 4,114 girls, nor in many ways do we want to. But I'm very happy and am working a considerable amount of time with descendants to establish their family connections. I'm doing a lot of work back here on the workhouse material, and they are doing work in Australia, where like our shipping lists, our birth, deaths and marriage certificates are second to none for establishing where people are from. And they can often tell me exactly where they're from, and trying to reconstruct their lives, whether they had great lives, bad lives, what happened to them in Australia. And this young woman is part of our committee. She's our IT team. As you can see, she's managed to take a photo of that section of the glass of the memorial and highlight the name from which she and her mother are descended. So there's Julie Plant and her daughter Melissa. So there's all ways of remembering these women. This gentleman, Jim Edwards, who unfortunately died late last year, his wife had predeceased him some years ago, and he became totally passionate about his orphan ancestor, Hannah Rafferty. Here's a surviving photograph of her. And he received one of the first Australian Heritage Awards from the then Irish Consul General Katrina Inglesby a couple of years ago. And here they are together pointing at the name of Hannah Rafferty in the glass. So there's all sorts of ways of remembering and memorialising the famine orphan girls, but also immigrants in general. And so back to the memorial and a few other images of the memorial. This is taken from the inside at night. It's illuminated. And there are becoming small memorials around Australia to these girls. This one that Richard and Cheryl Mongan, as he mentioned before, were involved in putting up in the Gaylong Cemetery, a small cemetery associated with what was a Redemptorist monastery in the middle of the Australian countryside. And this girl had no headstone, but with Cheryl and Richard's work on this girl, it reads, "In memory of Anne Ryan, who arrived in Sydney on the Thomas Arbuthnot on the 3rd of February 1850 and was hired by Ned Ryan, who came to Australia as a convict with a group of other guys who burnt down an army barracks in Tipperary and were all transported. He did extremely well, becoming a large farming man in this district in what is Gaylong House. It was employed Anne Ryan, and so it's a memory to all the female workhouse orphans of the Great Irish Famine who rest in unmarked graves across Australia. Anne married John Howcroft and had 2 daughters, Anne and Mary, and she was from Scariff in Clare, and she died in October 1855 and is buried in Gaylong. The other large, if you like, memorial in Australia is on the Strand at Williamstown out of Melbourne, where the ships that came into Victoria landed. And this is Dr. Val Noon, who was instrumental in having this memorial put up, and it's a large piece of granite rock which has inscriptions in Irish and English on it, memorialising those girls who landed in Victoria. And back to the famine memorial in Sydney. I was up there for a meeting a couple of years ago, and there was a wedding taking place at the memorial, or about to take place. I was there actually before it, and I said to one of the groomsmen, do you realise that your friend is about to be married on a memorial to the dead? And he looked at me kind of blankly, like young men do these days, and said, yeah, I guess it is, but we just like it. So this couple had 2 plinths with flowers on it, and they got married in a civil ceremony at the memorial, had no association with it whatsoever. I never inquired of their names because it wasn't really relevant, and they signed the marriage register on the famine table. So it's a living memorial. And every year, on the Sunday, I thought I had an image of that, may not have, sorry, I don't. Every year on the last Sunday in August, which is the time that this memorial was unveiled, we have a gathering there. And hundreds of people turn up, descendants of orphan girls, but also people in general who are interested in the Irish, Australian, and in general, immigration to Australia. The fact that the architect, the artists of this were an Australian girl of Irish ancestry, and the main artist, her husband, is an Iranian immigrant. So it's representative of all immigrants that have come to Australia by extension. We have an outreach, 3 what we call outreach programs. We donate money to Mamra House, which is in the western suburbs of Sydney, which is a place run by what were the Sisters of Mercy. It's recently been taken over by Catholic Care, where they sponsor Sudanese refugees and teach them to grow and be self-sustaining, to grow plants and vegetables and train them in that way. So we've donated over 40,000 Australian dollars to that cause. We sponsor a bursary for a student at the University of Western Sydney, which again is in that Western Sydney area of Sydney, where modern immigrants are settling, and hopefully we will build that bursary up to be a fully sponsoring scholarship to put a girl through full 3 years of university who has come either as an immigrant herself or is the parents of refugees, or is the daughter of refugees. And there's also a prize at Macquarie University. So people can contribute to all 3 of those as tax deductibles, donations, or we have our own funding which we contribute then to the above causes. Just a final plug for some of the books that I've been involved in publishing. Liz Russian, my fellow authoress, and I formed a small publishing company a couple of years ago to publish what we considered to be good immigration stories. From my point of view, as many of the Irish ones as I can possibly do. And one of our first books, of course, was Richard's PhD, which he had completed in Canberra in the 1990s and which had never been published. So we published that, and also the Fair Game, which I've mentioned already, and several other publications which are here, if anyone wants to purchase them or just to be aware that they exist. Quarantined, which was my master's on a shipload of Irish girls that came to Sydney. And Colonial Duchesses, 3 Irish ships that came to Sydney in the 1830s, and also a few collections of essays on the women, which is a nobility of the Irish conference that was held in Adelaide a couple of years ago, looking at whether people had actually moved from their native places to somewhere else before they ultimately immigrated out of the country, both out of Australia, out of Ireland or out of England. And then a paper on the role of Catholic colleges. And the story of an Australian born of Irish immigrants, a man who went to Gallipoli, was wounded, and his story is a very interesting story. Tom Scale, who was blinded and ended up doing a lecture theatre, lecture tours in America, encouraging the Americans towards the end of the war to sign up to fight in World War I. And The Price of a Wife, which is a very topical story at the moment, but is actually the turn of the century, 1901, about a priest who was the 2IC of Sydney, not the Archbishop's 2IC, who reputedly had an affair with a woman, and then the woman and her husband took him to court to claim damages. It's a great story, written by Anne Cunningham, who's an Irish-born, in fact she's from Carlingford Lock, just down the road, but now lives and works in Sydney. So they're the basic stories that